Hello, everyone. Today we're going to unpack one of the most practical and most underestimated topics in organizational behavior: organizational structure. When people hear structure, they often picture an org chart and assume the topic is administrative. But structure is not just a diagram. Structure is a behavioral system. It determines who talks to whom, how quickly decisions happen, how conflict shows up, how innovation gets supported or suppressed, and whether employees feel trusted or trapped. In other words, structure quietly shapes the everyday psychology of work. A simple way to define structure is this: it's the formal way jobs are divided, grouped, and coordinated. The moment an organization gets bigger than a handful of people, it has to make choices about coordination. Who does what? How do we avoid duplication? How do we make sure critical tasks don't fall through the cracks? How do we handle decisions that affect multiple teams? And because human attention is limited, structural choices always create trade-offs. Whatever structure you choose makes some things easier and other things harder. The key is to understand those trade-offs and design structure to fit your goals and your environment, rather than copying whatever is fashionable. Let's start with the building blocks. 7 structural elements that show up in almost every organization in some form. The first is work specialization, also called division of labor. This is the degree to which tasks are broken into separate jobs. Specialization can improve efficiency because people get better through repetition and focus. When tasks are stable and measurable, specialization can be a powerful performance tool, but there is a well-known downside. Over-specialization can create boredom, fatigue, stress, and disengagement. It can also reduce quality if people stop seeing the whole product and only optimize their tiny slice. The managerial art here is calibration. Some tasks benefit from tight specialization, while others require variety, learning, and broader ownership. If you're designing roles for knowledge work or creative work, excessive specialization can backfire by reducing autonomy and meaning. The second element is departmentalization, how you group jobs so that work can be coordinated. You can group by function, which means putting similar specialists together, like marketing, finance, operations, and HR. This often creates efficiencies because people share expertise and tools. But it can also create silos, where functions optimize their own goals and lose sight of the overall mission. You can also group by product or service, meaning all the functions needed for a product sit under one leader. That can increase accountability and speed for that product, but it may duplicate expertise across products. You can group by geography, which can be useful when customer needs vary across regions or logistics matter. You can group by process, where teams are organized around stages in a workflow, and you can group by customer type, where teams specialize around particular customer segments. Each approach solves a coordination problem but introduces a different risk, whether it's duplication, siloing, or uneven standards. The third element is chain of command, the traditional idea that there is an unbroken line of authority from top to bottom and that people know who reports to whom. For a long time, this was treated as essential. Today, it matters less in many organizations because information is widely accessible, employees are more empowered, and work is often done through cross-functional teams. Still, chain of command hasn't disappeared. It often becomes more visible under stress during crises, compliance situations, or high-stakes decisions when people want clarity and accountability. One classic principle related to chain of command is unity of command, the idea that each person should report to one boss. That principle reduces confusion, but modern structures sometimes violate it deliberately to increase coordination across complex work. The fourth element is span of control, how many people a manager directly supervises. A wider span typically reduces costs because it means fewer managers and fewer layers. But if the span becomes too wide, managers may not be able to coach, coordinate, and support effectively. A narrow span can create close oversight, but it also creates extra layers, slower communication, and often a culture of micromanagement. Many organizations have moved toward wider spans, but the right span depends on the complexity of the work, the capability of employees, the quality of systems, and the level of standardization. The fifth element is centralization versus decentralization, meaning where decision authority sits. In a centralized system, decisions are concentrated at the top. This can create consistency and control, and it may be useful when coordination must be tight. In a decentralized system, decision authority is distributed. That can increase speed, flexibility, and local responsiveness. It can also increase involvement, which often supports motivation because people feel more ownership. But decentralization can create coordination problems when multiple units must align, and it can increase risk-taking if control systems are weak. Again, structure is a trade-off. Centralization often buys consistency, while decentralization often buys adaptability. The sixth element is formalization, the degree to which jobs are standardized through rules, procedures, and clear expectations. High formalization means less discretion and more predictability. Low formalization means more discretion and flexibility. Formalization can be a blessing when quality, safety, reliability, and compliance matter, or when a crisis demands consistent execution. But too much formalization can strangle innovation, slow learning, and make people feel like replaceable parts. The seventh element is boundary spanning, which is one of the most modern and behaviorally important ideas in structure. Organizations create divisions to manage complexity, but those divisions can become barriers. Boundary spanning refers to relationships and roles that connect people across teams, functions, and even organizations. When boundary spanning is strong, information moves, coordination improves, and innovation becomes more likely because ideas recombine across silos. Boundary spanning can happen informally through personal networks, and it can be supported formally through liaison roles, cross-functional committees, job rotation, and deliberate internal communication systems. The key point is that the most effective organizations don't eliminate structure. They build bridges across it. With those building blocks in mind, we can look at common structural forms. You can think of these as packages that combine the elements in different ways. One classic form is the simple structure. This is typical in small businesses and early-stage startups. It has low departmentalization, wide spans of control, authority centralized in one person, and little formalization. Its strength is speed. Decisions happen quickly, accountability is clear, and the organization can pivot. Its weakness is that it doesn't scale well. As complexity grows, the central decision maker becomes overloaded, and the organization can become chaotic or dependent on one person's knowledge and energy. The simple structure can be brilliant early on and dangerous later if the organization refuses to evolve. Another classic form is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is built on standardization. It relies on specialized roles, clear rules, formal procedures, functional departments, centralized authority, and a chain of command. Its core strength is efficiency and reliability in stable conditions. If the organization's work is routine and predictable, think large-scale operations with repeatable processes, bureaucracy can produce consistent performance. The weaknesses are familiar: silos, rule obsession, slow response, and difficulty innovating when the environment shifts. Bureaucracy is not automatically bad. It's a tool that fits some contexts and fails in others. The real problem is when an organization uses a bureaucratic structure in a volatile, complex environment and then blames employees for not being agile. A third common form is the matrix structure, which combines functional and product structures. In a matrix, employees have two lines of authority, a functional manager and a product or project manager. This breaks unity of command on purpose to improve coordination for complex, interdependent work. The matrix can be powerful when organizations need to share scarce experts across multiple projects and must coordinate across functions. But the matrix creates its own behavioral challenges, role ambiguity, role conflict, stress, and power struggles. People can feel pulled in two directions, and conflict can rise if priorities are unclear. Matrix structures work best when the culture supports collaboration and when decision rights are clearly defined so that two bosses doesn't become two competing agendas. Now let's look at newer and more flexible approaches. A virtual or network structure is often a small core organization that outsources major functions to partners. The core focuses on what it does best and coordinates relationships through contracts and alliances. This structure can be extremely flexible and fast because it avoids building everything in-house. But it can also create chronic uncertainty because roles and responsibilities may shift frequently, and control is more complicated when critical work sits outside your boundaries. Virtual structures can also invite politics because ambiguity creates space for influence games. When it's unclear who owns what, people negotiate power informally. A team-based structure attempts to reduce the traditional chain of command and replace departments with empowered teams. The idea is to remove vertical boundaries, reduce status barriers, and increase responsiveness. In practice, team structures can improve speed and ownership, especially when teams have the resources and authority they need. But team structures require strong clarity around goals, roles, and coordination mechanisms. Without clarity, they can drift into diffusion of responsibility, where everyone is in charge and therefore no one is. The team structure is not an anti-structure. It is a different structure that depends on norms, shared accountability, and deliberate coordination. A more unusual but interesting form is the circular structure. Imagine concentric rings rather than a pyramid. Executives in the center, then rings of managers, then specialists, then frontline workers. The appeal is symbolic. It suggests a spreading vision rather than top-down command. But the practical risk is similar to many modern hybrid structures. People can become unclear about reporting relationships and decision rights. When people don't know who runs the show, politics tends to fill the gap. Now, let's talk about a structural change many organizations experience: downsizing. Downsizing is a systematic effort to become leaner by reducing staff, closing units, or shedding activities that don't add value. Leaders often frame downsizing as efficiency, agility, or strategic focus, but the behavioral effects can be profound. Employees who remain, the survivors, often experience anxiety about future layoffs, reduced commitment, and increased stress. Trust can drop if people believe decisions were unfair or communication was evasive. Downsizing can also lead to voluntary turnover among high performers, which means the organization loses critical human capital right when it needs it most. If an organization becomes lean without also investing in better systems, coordination, and support, it can become not lean but anemic. When downsizing is necessary, what matters is how it's done. Transparency, participation where possible, support for those leaving, and reinvestment in practices that help the remaining workforce succeed. At this point, a deeper question emerges. Why do structures differ? Why do some organizations look mechanistic while others look organic? Mechanistic structures are high in formalization, high in departmentalization, and often centralized, with communication flowing mainly downward. They emphasize stability, predictability, and control. Organic structures are lower in formalization, more flexible, more participative, and rely on broader communication networks. They emphasize adaptability, learning, and responsiveness. You can think of mechanistic as optimized for efficiency under stable conditions, and organic as optimized for innovation under uncertain conditions. Most real organizations are hybrids. They may need mechanistic reliability in some units, like compliance, finance, safety, and organic flexibility in others, like product development or innovation labs. So, what determines the right structure? A major driver is strategy. If an organization pursues innovation, it often needs flexibility, boundary spanning, and fast learning, which tends to align with organic design. If the strategy is cost minimization, organizations often prefer control, efficiency, and standardization, which tends to align with mechanistic design. If the strategy is imitation, blending proven elements with manageable risk, organizations often use a hybrid, mechanistic core operations with organic subunits for new initiatives. Size matters too. Large organizations tend to have more specialization, more layers, more rules, and more departmentalization. Interestingly, the effective size becomes less dramatic as organizations get very large. At some point, adding more people doesn't change the structure as dramatically as it did earlier, but the overall pattern is that complexity pushes organizations toward more formal structure, unless they deliberately design flexible mechanisms to counterbalance it. Technology is another driver. Here, technology means the way an organization turns inputs into outputs. Structures tend to adapt to the workflow. Routine technologies often match well with standardization and mechanistic controls. Non-routine, complex technologies often require flexible coordination and organic design. And a very modern point is that structure can become embedded in digital systems. Your software and data architecture can reinforce how work is coordinated. If your systems require endless approvals and rigid forms, the technology itself becomes bureaucracy. If your systems enable transparency, rapid collaboration, and clear decision tracking, technology can support organic coordination. The environment is also critical. Think about the environment in terms of capacity, volatility, and complexity. Capacity is how much the environment can support growth, whether resources are abundant or scarce. Volatility is how unpredictable change is. Complexity is how many different external forces you must monitor: customers, competitors, regulators, public pressure, global supply chains, and so on. When the environment is scarce, volatile, and complex, uncertainty is high, and organic structures tend to be more effective because they allow rapid adaptation. When the environment is abundant, stable, and simple, mechanistic structures can be effective because stability allows efficiency to dominate. A final driver is institutions, cultural and regulatory pressures that shape what structures are seen as legitimate. Some industries require strict reporting relationships and information controls. Some cultures view hierarchy as appropriate and comforting, while others prefer flatter, participative approaches. Sometimes organizations keep a structure simply because it's what they've always done. Sometimes they copy structures because of trends, not because of fit. Institutional pressures are powerful precisely because they can make certain structures feel normal even when they aren't effective. Now, since we are doing organizational behavior, we need to connect structure back to people. How does structure affect employee behavior? The honest answer is it depends, and individual differences matter. Some people thrive in organic environments. They enjoy autonomy, ambiguity, and self direction. Others find that same environment stressful and frustrating. They prefer clarity, predictable routines, and standardized expectations. People don't select employers randomly. Individuals who want predictability often gravitate toward mechanistic contexts. Individuals who want autonomy often seek out organic contexts. When there's a mismatch, say an autonomy oriented employee in a rigid bureaucracy or a predictability oriented employee in a highly ambiguous startup, stress increases and performance can drop. Span of control is a great example of why you can't generalize too easily. A wide span might increase autonomy because the manager can't micromanage everyone, but it can also reduce support if employees need coaching. A narrow span might improve support for inexperienced employees, but it can also create a controlling climate and slow decision making. Centralization also has mixed effects. Decentralization can increase job satisfaction for employees who value voice and control, but for employees who prefer clear direction, decentralization can feel like chaos, especially if expectations are unclear. National culture shapes these preferences too. In high power distance cultures, employees may be more comfortable with mechanistic structures and clear authority relationships. In low power distance cultures, employees may expect participation, flatter hierarchies, and empowerment. This isn't about stereotypes, it's about recognizing that what feels respectful and legitimate can vary across contexts, which influences how structure is experienced psychologically. So, how should leaders think about structure in practice? Here is a useful mindset. Structure is the organization's coordination strategy. It is the answer to the question, how do we get work done reliably at scale? If your structure is too rigid for your environment, you get slow response, frustration, and innovation failure. If your structure is too loose for your environment, you get confusion, politics, and inconsistent execution. The best designs don't chase ideals like flat is always good or rules are always bad. They build the right mix of clarity and flexibility, and they deliberately create boundary spanning so that specialization doesn't become fragmentation. If you want a final way to remember this, think in terms of tensions: efficiency versus adaptability, control versus empowerment, clarity versus flexibility, standardization versus creativity. Structure is how organizations manage these tensions, and if you learn to see structure as a behavioral system rather than a chart, you'll become much better at diagnosing real organizational problems, because many problems that look like people issues are actually structural issues. Unclear decision rights, misaligned incentives across departments, excessive layers, missing boundary spanning roles, or the wrong balance of centralization and formalization for the environment. That's the core message. You can't manage behavior without understanding structure, because structure is the invisible hand that shapes behavior every day. Thank you for joining me.